The presidency of Boris Yeltsin began with his first inauguration on July 10, 1991, and ended on December 31, 1999 when he announced his resignation. A referendum held on March 17, 1991 approved the creation of the post of President of Russia. Yeltsin was elected Russia's first president in a presidential election held on June 12, 1991. During his first term, Yeltsin implemented reforms including economic shock therapy and nationwide privatization to transform Russia's command economy into a market economy. The country faced a severe economic downturn following the reforms as well as persistent low oil and commodity prices, the emergence of currencies which replaced the Soviet ruble in the former Soviet Union, and an increase in public debt with the depreciation of the Russian ruble. These issues affected not only Russia, but the economies of other post-Soviet states. Within a few years of his presidency, many of Yeltsin's initial supporters started to criticize his leadership, including then Vice President Alexander Ruskoy. Tensions with the Russian parliament culminated in the 1993 Russian constitutional crisis after Yeltsin ordered the unconstitutional dissolution of the parliament. As a result, the parliament attempted to impeach Yeltsin. In October 1993, troops loyal to Yeltsin stopped an armed uprising outside of the parliament building, following which a new constitution was introduced and Yeltsin deepened his efforts to transform the economy. In 1994, Yeltsin launched a war against Chechen separatists in an attempt to restore federal control of the region, which ended in a Russian withdrawal 2 years later. During his second term, the government defaulted on its debt and the ruble collapsed in the 1998 Russian financial crisis. On December 31, 1999, Yeltsin announced his resignation, with his chosen successor, then Prime Minister Vladimir Putin, succeeding him as acting president, who then was elected to his first presidential term following an election held on March 26, 2000. Yeltsin left office widely unpopular with the Russian population. Early life, education, and early career. 1931–1948, childhood. Boris Yeltsin was born on February 1, 1931 in the village of Butka, Talitsky district, Sverdlovsk Oblast, then in the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, one of the republics of the Soviet Union. His family, who were ethnic Russians, had lived in this area of the Urals since at least the 18th century. His father, Nikolai Yeltsin, had married his mother, Klavdiya Vasilievna Starygina, in 1928. Yeltsin always remained closer to his mother than to his father, the latter beat his wife and children on various occasions. The Soviet Union was then under the dictatorship of Joseph Stalin, who led the one-party state governed by the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Seeking to convert the country into a socialist society according to Marxist-Leninist doctrine, in the late 1920s Stalin's government had initiated a project of mass rural collectivization coupled with dekulakization. As a prosperous farmer, Yeltsin's paternal grandfather, Ignaty, was accused of being a kulak in 1930. His farm, which was in Basmanovo, was confiscated, and he and his family were forced to reside in a cottage in nearby Butka. There, Nikolai and Ignaty's other children were allowed to join the local kolkhoz, but Ignaty himself was not. He and his wife, Anna, were exiled in 1934 to Nadezdinsk, where he died 2 years later. As an infant, Yeltsin was christened in the Russian Orthodox Church. His mother was devout, and his father unobservant. In the years after his birth, the area was hit by the famine of 1932–1933. Throughout his childhood, Yeltsin was often hungry. In 1932, Yeltsin's parents moved to Kazan, where Yeltsin attended kindergarten. There, in 1934, the OGPU State Security Services arrested Nikolai, accused him of anti-Soviet agitation, and sentenced him to 3 years in the Dmitrov labor camp. Yeltsin and his mother then were ejected from their residence and were taken in by friends. Klavdia worked at a garment factory in her husband's absence. In October 1936, Nikolai returned. In July 1937, the couple's second child, Mikhail, was born. That month, they moved to Bereznyaki, in Perm Krai, where Nikolai got work on a potash combine project. There, in July 1944, they had a third child, the daughter, Valentina. Between 1939 and 1945, Yeltsin received a primary education at Bereznyakhi's Railway School No. 95. Academically, he did well at primary school and was repeatedly elected class monitor by fellow pupils. There, he also took part in activities organized by the Komsomol and Vladimir Lenin All-Union Pioneer Organization. This overlapped with Soviet involvement in the Second World War, during which Yeltsin's paternal uncle, Andrian, served in the Red Army and was killed. From 1945 to 1949, Yeltsin studied at the Municipal Secondary School No. 1, also known as Pushkin High School. Yeltsin did well at secondary school, and there took an increasing interest in sport, becoming captain of the school's volleyball squad. He enjoyed playing pranks and in one instance played with a grenade, which blew off the thumb and index finger of his left hand. With friends, he would go on summer walking expeditions in the adjacent taiga, sometimes for many weeks. 1949–1960, University and career in construction. In September 1949, Yeltsin was admitted to the Ural Polytechnic Institute in Sverdlovsk. He took the stream in industrial and civil engineering, which included courses in maths, physics, materials and soil science, and draftsmanship. He was also required to study Marxist-Leninist doctrine and choose a language course, for which he selected German, although never became adept at it. Tuition was free and he was provided a small stipend to live on, which he supplemented by unloading railway trucks for a small wage. Academically, he achieved high grades, although temporarily dropped out in 1952 when afflicted with tonsillitis and rheumatic fever. He devoted much time to athletics, and joined the UPI volleyball team. He avoided any involvement in political organizations while there. During the summer 1953 break, he traveled across the Soviet Union, touring the Volga, Central Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, and Georgia. Much of the travel was achieved by hitchhiking on freight trains. It was at UPI that he began a relationship with Nana Iosifovna Gyrina, a fellow student who would later become his wife. Yeltsin completed his studies in June 1955. Leaving the Ural Polytechnic Institute, Yeltsin was assigned to work with the Lower Izet Construction Directorate in Sverdlovsk. At his request, he served the first year as a trainee in various building trades. He quickly rose through the organization's ranks. In June 1956 he was promoted to foreman, and in June 1957 was promoted again, to the position of work superintendent. In these positions, he confronted a widespread alcoholism and a lack of motivation among construction workers, an irregular supply of materials, and the regular theft or vandalism of materials that were available. He soon imposed fines for those who damaged or stole materials or engaged in absenteeism, and closely monitored productivity. His work on the construction of a textile factory, for which he oversaw 1,000 workers, brought him wider recognition. In June 1958 he became a senior work superintendent and in January 1960 was made head engineer of Construction Directorate No. 13. At the same time, Yeltsin's family was growing. In September 1956, he married Gyrina. She soon got work at a scientific research institute, where she remained for 29 years. In August 1957, their daughter Yelena was born, followed by a second daughter, Tatyana, in January 1960. During this period, they moved through a succession of apartments. On family holidays, Yeltsin took his family to a lake in northern Russia and to the Black Sea coast. CPSU career. 1960–1975, early membership of the Communist Party. In March 1960, Yeltsin became a probationary member of the governing Communist Party and a full member in March 1961. In his later autobiography, he stated that his original reasons for joining were sincere and rooted in a genuine belief in the party's socialist ideals. In other interviews he instead stated that he joined because membership was a necessity for career advancement. His career continued to progress during the early 1960s. In February 1962 he was promoted chief of the Construction Directorate. In June 1963, Yeltsin was reassigned to the Sverdlovsk house building combine as its head engineer, and in December 1965 became the combine's director. During this period he was largely involved in building residential housing, the expansion of which was a major priority for the government. He gained a reputation within the construction industry as a hard worker who was punctual and effective and who was used to meeting the targets set forth by the state apparatus. There had been plans to award him the Order of Lenin for his work, although this was scrapped after a 5-story building he was constructing collapsed in March 1966. An official investigation found that Yeltsin was not culpable for the accident. Within the local Communist Party, Yeltsin gained a patron in Yakov Ryabov, who became the first secretary of the party Gorkom in 1963. In April 1968, Ryabov decided to recruit Yeltsin into the regional party apparatus, proposing him for a vacancy in the Obkom's Department for Construction. Ryabov ensured that Yeltsin got the job despite objections that he was not a long-standing party member. That year, Yeltsin and his family moved into a 4-room apartment on Maminsiberyak Street, downtown Sverdlovsk. Yeltsin then received his second Order of the Red Banner of Labor for his work completing a cold rolling mill at the Upper Izet Works, a project for which he had overseen the actions of 15,000 laborers. In the late 1960s, Yeltsin was permitted to visit the West for the first time as he was sent on a trip to France. In 1975, Yeltsin was then made one of the 5 Obkom secretaries in the Sverdlovsk Oblast, a position that gave him responsibility not only for construction in the region but also for the forest and the pulp and paper industries. Also in 1975, his family relocated to a flat in the House of Old Bolsheviks on March Street. 1976–1985, First Secretary of the Sverdlovsk Oblast. In October 1976, Ryabov was promoted to a new position in Moscow. He recommended that Yeltsin replace him as the first secretary of the party committee in Sverdlovsk Oblast. Leonid Brezhnev, who then led the Soviet Union as General Secretary of the party's Central Committee, interviewed Yeltsin personally to determine his suitability and agreed with Ryabov's assessment. At the Central Committee's recommendation, the Sverdlovsk Obkom then unanimously voted to appoint Yeltsin as its first secretary. This made him one of the youngest provincial first secretaries in the RSFSR, and gave him significant power within the province. Where possible, Yeltsin tried to improve consumer welfare in the province, arguing that it would make for more productive workers. Under his provincial leadership, work started on various construction and infrastructure projects in the city of Sverdlovsk, including a subway system, the replacement of its barracks housing, new theaters, and a circus, the refurbishment of its 1912 opera house, and youth housing projects to build new homes for young families. In September 1977, Yeltsin carried out orders to demolish the Ipadiev house, the location where the Romanov royal family had been killed in 1918, over the government's fears that it was attracting growing foreign and domestic attention. He was also responsible for punishing those living in the province who wrote or published material that the Soviet government considered to be seditious or damaging to the established order. Yeltsin sat on the Civil-Military Collegium of the Urals Military District and attended its field exercises. In October 1978, the Ministry of Defense gave him the rank of colonel. Also in 1978, Yeltsin was elected without opposition to the Supreme Soviet. In 1979, Yeltsin and his family moved into a 5-room apartment at the Working Youth Embankment in Sverdlovsk. In February 1981, Yeltsin gave a speech to the 25th CPSU Congress, and on the final day of the Congress was selected to join the Communist Party Central Committee. Yeltsin's reports to party meetings reflected the ideological conformity that was expected within the authoritarian state. Yeltsin played along with the personality cult surrounding Brezhnev, but he was contemptuous of what he saw as the Soviets' leaders' vanity and sloth. He later claimed to have quashed plans for a Brezhnev museum in Sverdlovsk. While first secretary, his worldview began to shift, influenced by his reading. He kept up with a wide range of journals published in the country and also claimed to have read an illegally printed samizdat copy of Alexander Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago. Many of his concerns about the Soviet system were prosaic rather than ideological, as he believed that the system was losing effectiveness and beginning to decay. He was increasingly faced with the problem of Russia's place within the Soviet Union. Unlike other republics in the country, the RSFSR lacked the same levels of autonomy from the central government in Moscow. In the early 1980s, he and Yuri Petrov privately devised a tripartite scheme for reforming the Soviet Union that would involve strengthening the Russian government, but it was never presented publicly. By 1980, Yeltsin had developed the habit of appearing unannounced in factories, shops, and public transport to get a closer look at the realities of Soviet life. In May 1981, he held a question-and-answer session with college students at the Sverdlovsk Youth Palace, where he was unusually frank in his discussion of the country's problems. In December 1982, he then gave a television broadcast for the region in which he responded to various letters. This personalized approach to interacting with the public brought disapproval from some Communist Party figures, such as First Secretary of Tyumen Oblast, Gennady Bogomyakov, although the Central Committee showed no concern. In 1981, he was awarded the Order of Lenin for his work. The following year, Brezhnev died and was succeeded by Yuri Andropov, who in turn ruled for 15 months before his own death. Yeltsin spoke positively about Andropov. Andropov was succeeded by another short-lived leader, Konstantin Chernenko. After his death, Yeltsin took part in the Central Committee plenum which appointed Mikhail Gorbachev the new General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and thus de facto Soviet leader, in March 1985. 1985, relocation to Moscow to become head of Gorkom. Gorbachev was interested in reforming the Soviet Union and, at the urging of Yegor Lygakyov, the organizational secretary of the Central Committee, soon summoned Yeltsin to meet with him as a potential ally in his efforts. Yeltsin had some reservations about Gorbachev as a leader, deeming him controlling and patronizing, but committed himself to the latter's project of reform. In April 1985, Gorbachev appointed Yeltsin as the head of the construction department of the party's Central Committee. Although it entailed moving to the capital city, Yeltsin was unhappy with what he regarded as a demotion. There, he was issued a nomenklatura flat at 54 2nd Tverskaya Yamskaya Street, where his daughter Tatyana and her son and husband soon joined him and his wife. Gorbachev soon promoted Yeltsin to Secretary of the Central Committee for Construction and Capital Investment, a position within the powerful CPSU Central Committee Secretariat, a move approved by the Central Committee plenum in July 1985. With Gorbachev's support, in December 1985, Yeltsin was installed as the first secretary of the Moscow Gorkom of the CPSU. He was now responsible for managing the Soviet capital city, which had a population of 8.7 million. In February 1986, Yeltsin became a candidate member of the Politburo. At that point he formally left the Secretariat to concentrate on his role in Moscow. Over the coming year he removed many of the old secretaries of the Gorkom, replacing them with younger individuals, particularly with backgrounds in factory management. In August 1986, Yeltsin gave a 2-hour report to the party conference in which he talked about Moscow's problems, including issues that had previously not been spoken about publicly. Gorbachev described the speech as a strong fresh wind for the party. Yeltsin expressed a similar message at the 22nd Congress of the CPSU in February 1986 and then in a speech at the House of Political Enlightenment in April 1987. Resignation. On September 10, 1987, after a lecture from hardliner Yegor Lygakiov at the Politburo for allowing 2 small unsanctioned demonstrations on Moscow streets, Yeltsin wrote a letter of resignation to Gorbachev, who was holidaying on the Black Sea. When Gorbachev received the letter he was stunned. Nobody in Soviet history had voluntarily resigned from the ranks of the Politburo. Gorbachev phoned Yeltsin and asked him to reconsider. On October 27, 1987, at the plenary meeting of the Central Committee of the CPSU, Yeltsin, frustrated that Gorbachev had not addressed any of the issues outlined in his resignation letter, asked to speak. He expressed his discontent with the slow pace of reform in society, the servility shown to the General Secretary, and opposition to him from Lygakiov making his position untenable, before requesting to resign from the Politburo, adding that the city committee would decide whether he should resign from the post of first secretary of the Moscow Communist Party. Aside from the fact that no one had ever quit the Politburo before, no one in the party had addressed a leader of the party in such a manner in front of the Central Committee since Leon Trotsky in the 1920s. In his reply, Gorbachev accused Yeltsin of political immaturity and absolute irresponsibility. Nobody in the Central Committee backed Yeltsin. Within days, news of Yeltsin's actions leaked and rumors of his secret speech at the Central Committee spread throughout Moscow. Soon fabricated samizdat versions began to circulate. This was the beginning of Yeltsin's rise as a rebel and growth in popularity as an anti-establishment figure. Gorbachev called a meeting of the Moscow City Party Committee for November 11, 1987 to launch another crushing attack on Yeltsin and confirm his dismissal. On November 9, 1987, Yeltsin apparently tried to kill himself and was rushed to the hospital bleeding profusely from self-inflicted cuts to his chest. Gorbachev ordered the injured Yeltsin from his hospital bed to the Moscow Party plenum 2 days later, where he was ritually denounced by the party faithful in what was reminiscent of a Stalinist show trial before he was fired from the post of first secretary of the Moscow Communist Party. Yeltsin said he would never forgive Gorbachev for this immoral and inhuman treatment. Yeltsin was demoted to the position of first deputy commissioner for the State Committee for Construction. At the next meeting of the Central Committee on February 24, 1988, Yeltsin was removed from his position as a candidate member of the Politburo. He was perturbed and humiliated but began plotting his revenge. His opportunity came with Gorbachev's establishment of the Congress of People's Deputies. Yeltsin recovered, and started intensively criticizing Gorbachev, highlighting the slow pace of reform in the Soviet Union as his major argument. Yeltsin's criticism of the Politburo and Gorbachev led to a smear campaign against him, in which examples of Yeltsin's awkward behavior were used against him. Speaking at the CPSU conference in 1988, Yegor Lygakiov stated, "Boris, you are wrong." An article in Pravda described Yeltsin as drunk at a lecture during his visit to the United States in September 1989, an allegation which appeared to be confirmed by a TV account of his speech. However, popular dissatisfaction with the regime was very strong, and these attempts to smear Yeltsin only added to his popularity. In another incident, Yeltsin fell from a bridge. Commenting on this event, Yeltsin hinted that he was helped to fall by the enemies of perestroika, but his opponents suggested that he was simply drunk. On March 26, 1989, Yeltsin was elected to the Congress of People's Deputies of the Soviet Union as the delegate from Moscow district with a decisive 92% of the vote, and on May 29, 1989, he was elected by the Congress of People's Deputies to a seat on the Supreme Soviet of the Soviet Union. On July 19, 1989, Yeltsin announced the formation of the radical pro-reform faction in the Congress of People's Deputies, the Inter-Regional Group of Deputies, and on July 29, 1989 was elected one of the 5 CO chairmen of the Inter-Regional Group. On September 16, 1989, Yeltsin toured a medium-sized grocery store in Texas. Leon Aaron, quoting a Yeltsin associate, wrote in his 2000 biography, Yeltsin, A Revolutionary Life, for a long time, on the plane to Miami, he sat motionless, his head in his hands. "What have they done to our poor people?" he said after a long silence. He added, on his return to Moscow, Yeltsin would confess the pain he had felt after the Houston excursion, the pain for all of us, for our country so rich, so talented, and so exhausted by incessant experiments. He wrote that Mr. Yeltsin added, "I think we have committed a crime against our people by making their standard of living so incomparably lower than that of the Americans." An aide, Lev Sukhanov, was reported to have said that it was at that moment that the last vestige of Bolshevism collapsed inside his boss. In his autobiography, Against the Grain, an autobiography, written and published in 1990, Yeltsin hinted in a small passage that after his tour, he made plans to open his own line of grocery stores and planned to fill it with government-subsidized goods in order to alleviate the country's problems. President of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. On March 4, 1990, Yeltsin was elected to the Congress of People's Deputies of Russia representing Sverdlovsk with 72% of the vote. On May 29, 1990, he was elected chairman of the Supreme Soviet of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, in spite of the fact that Gorbachev personally pleaded with the Russian deputies not to select Yeltsin. He was supported by both democratic and conservative members of the Supreme Soviet, which sought power in the developing political situation in the country. A part of this power struggle was the opposition between power structures of the Soviet Union and the RSFSR. In an attempt to gain more power, on June 12, 1990, the Congress of People's Deputies of the RSFSR adopted a declaration of sovereignty. On July 12, 1990, Yeltsin resigned from the CPSU in a dramatic speech before party members at the 28th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, some of whom responded by shouting "Shame!" 1991, Presidential election. During May 1991, Václav Havel invited Yeltsin to Prague, where the latter unambiguously condemned the Soviet intervention in 1968. On June 12, Yeltsin won 57% of the popular vote in the democratic presidential elections for the Russian Republic, defeating Gorbachev's preferred candidate, Nikolai Ryzhkov, who got just 16% of the vote, and 4 other candidates. In his election campaign, Yeltsin criticized the dictatorship of the center, but did not suggest the introduction of a market economy. Instead, he said that he would put his head on the rail track in the event of increased prices. Yeltsin took office on July 10, and reappointed Ivan Silayev as chairman of the Council of Ministers of the Russian SFSR. On August 18, 1991, a coup against Gorbachev was launched by the government members opposed to perestroika. Gorbachev was held in Crimea while Yeltsin raced to the White House of Russia in Moscow to defy the coup, making a memorable speech from atop the turret of a tank onto which he had climbed. The White House was surrounded by the military, but the troops defected in the face of mass popular demonstrations. By August 21 most of the coup leaders had fled Moscow and Gorbachev was rescued from Crimea and then returned to Moscow. Yeltsin was subsequently hailed by his supporters around the world for rallying mass opposition to the coup. Although restored to his position, Gorbachev had been destroyed politically. Neither Union nor Russian power structures heeded his commands as support had swung over to Yeltsin. By September, Gorbachev could no longer influence events outside of Moscow. Taking advantage of the situation, Yeltsin began taking over what remained of the Soviet government, ministry by ministry including the Kremlin. On November 6, 1991, Yeltsin issued a decree banning all Communist Party activities on Russian soil. In early December 1991, Ukraine voted for independence from the Soviet Union. A week later, on December 8, Yeltsin met Ukrainian President Leonid Kravchuk and the leader of Belarus, Stanislav Shushkevich, in Belovaskaya Pushcha. In the Belovaza Accords, the three presidents declared that the Soviet Union no longer existed as a subject of international law and geopolitical reality, and announced the formation of a voluntary Commonwealth of independent states in its place. According to Gorbachev, Yeltsin kept the plans of the Belovaskaya meeting in strict secrecy, and the main goal of the dissolution of the Soviet Union was to get rid of Gorbachev, who by that time had started to recover his position after the events of August. Gorbachev has also accused Yeltsin of violating the people's will expressed in the referendum in which the majority voted to keep the Soviet Union united. On December 12, the Supreme Soviet of the RSFSR ratified the Belovaza Accords and denounced the 1922 Union Treaty. It also recalled the Russian deputies from the Council of the Union, leaving that body without a quorum. While this is regarded as the moment that the largest republic of the Soviet Union had seceded, this is not technically the case. Russia appeared to take the line that it was not possible to secede from a country that no longer existed. On December 17, in a meeting with Yeltsin, Gorbachev accepted the fait accompli and agreed to dissolve the Soviet Union. On December 24, by mutual agreement of the other CIS states, the Russian Federation took the Soviet Union's seat in the United Nations. The next day, Gorbachev resigned and handed the functions of his office to Yeltsin. On December 26, the Council of the Republics, the upper house of the Supreme Soviet, voted the Soviet Union out of existence, thereby ending the world's oldest, largest, and most powerful communist state. Economic relations between the former Soviet republics were severely compromised. Millions of ethnic Russians found themselves in the newly formed foreign countries. Initially, Yeltsin promoted the retention of national borders according to the pre-existing Soviet state borders, although this left ethnic Russians as a majority in parts of northern Kazakhstan, eastern Ukraine, and areas of Estonia and Latvia. President of the Russian Federation. 1991–1996, first term. Radical reforms. Confrontation with Parliament. The riddle of NATO. Chechnya. Norwegian rocket incident. Privatization and the rise of the oligarchs. Korean Airlines Flight 007. 1996 presidential election. 1996–1999, second term. Yeltsin underwent emergency quintuple heart bypass surgery in November 1996, and remained in the hospital for months. During his presidency, Russia received $40 billion in funds from the International Monetary Fund and other international lending organizations. However, his opponents allege that most of these funds were stolen by people from Yeltsin's circle and placed into foreign banks. In 1998, a political and economic crisis emerged when Yeltsin's government defaulted on its debts, causing financial markets to panic and the ruble to collapse in the 1998 Russian financial crisis. During the 1999 Kosovo War, Yeltsin strongly opposed the NATO military campaign against Yugoslavia, and warned of possible Russian intervention if NATO deployed ground troops to Kosovo. In televised comments he stated, "I told NATO, the Americans, the Germans, don't push us towards military action. Otherwise there will be a European war for sure and possibly a world war." Yeltsin said that NATO's bombing of Yugoslavia trampled upon the foundations of international law and the United Nations Charter. On August 9, 1999, Yeltsin fired his Prime Minister, Sergei Stepashin, and for the fourth time, fired his entire cabinet. In Stepashin's place, he appointed Vladimir Putin, relatively unknown at that time, and announced his wish to see Putin as his successor. In late 1999, Yeltsin and U.S. President Bill Clinton openly disagreed on the war in Chechnya. At the November meeting of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, Clinton pointed his finger at Yeltsin and demanded he halt bombing attacks that had resulted in many civilian casualties. Yeltsin immediately left the conference. In December, whilst visiting China to seek support on Chechnya, Yeltsin replied to Clinton's criticism of a Russian ultimatum to citizens of Grozny. He bluntly pronounced, "Yesterday, Clinton permitted himself to put pressure on Russia. It seems he has for a minute, for a second, for half a minute, forgotten that Russia has a full arsenal of nuclear weapons. He has forgotten about that." Clinton dismissed Yeltsin's comments stating, "I didn't think he'd forgotten that America was a great power when he disagreed with what I did in Kosovo." It fell to Putin to downplay Yeltsin's comments and present reassurances about U.S. and Russian relations. Attempted 1999 impeachment. Medvedev's corruption. Resignation. Electoral history. Heart disease and alcoholism. Yeltsin suffered from heart disease during his first term as president of the Russian Federation, probably continuing for the rest of his life. He is known to have suffered heart problems in March 1990, just after being elected as a member of parliament. It was common knowledge that, in early 1996, he was recuperating from a series of heart attacks and, soon after, he spent months in hospital recovering from a quintuple bypass operation. According to numerous reports, Yeltsin was alcohol dependent until 1996, when his worsening health made him give up heavy drinking. The topic made headlines abroad during Yeltsin's visit to the U.S. in 1989 for a series of lectures on social and political life in the Soviet Union. A report in the Italian newspaper La Repubblica, reprinted by Pravda, reported that Yeltsin often appeared drunk in public. His alcoholism was also the subject of media discussion following his meeting with U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Strobe Talbot following Clinton's inauguration in 1993 and an incident during a flight stopover at Shannon Airport, Ireland, in September 1994, when the waiting Irish Prime Minister, Albert Reynolds, was told that Yeltsin was unwell and would not be leaving the aircraft. Reynolds tried to make excuses for him in an effort to offset his own humiliation in waiting in vain outside the plane to meet him. Speaking to the media in March 2010, Yeltsin's daughter, Tatyana Yumasheva, claimed that her father had suffered a heart attack on the flight from the United States to Moscow and was therefore not in a position to leave the plane. According to former Deputy Prime Minister of Russia Boris Nemtsov, the bizarre behavior of Yeltsin resulted from strong drugs given to him by Kremlin doctors, which were incompatible even with a small amount of alcohol. This was discussed by journalist Yelena Tragubova from the Kremlin Pool in connection with an episode during Yeltsin's visit to Stockholm in 1997, when Yeltsin suddenly started talking nonsense, lost his balance, and almost fell down on the podium after drinking a single glass of champagne. In his memoirs, Yeltsin claimed no recollection of the event but did make a passing reference to the incident when he met Borg a year later at the World Circle Kabaddi Cup in Hamilton, Ontario, where they pair had been invited to present the trophy. He made a hasty withdrawal from the funeral of King Hussein of Jordan in February 1999 to use the facilities. After Yeltsin's death, Michael Stahl, a Dutch neurosurgeon, said that his team had been secretly flown to Moscow to operate on Yeltsin in 1999. Yeltsin suffered from an unspecified neurological disorder that affected his sense of balance, causing him to wobble as if in a drunken state. The goal of the operation was to reduce the pain. Bill Clinton claimed that on a 1995 visit to Washington, Yeltsin was found on Pennsylvania Avenue, drunk, in his underwear and trying to hail a taxi cab in order to find pizza. Yeltsin's personal and health problems received a great deal of attention in the global press. As the years went on, he was often viewed as an increasingly drunk and unstable leader, rather than the inspiring figure he was once seen as. The possibility that he might die in office was often discussed. Starting in the last years of his presidential term, Yeltsin's primary residence was the Gorky 9 presidential dacha west of Moscow. He made frequent stays at the nearby government sanatorium in Barvikha. In October 1999, Yeltsin was hospitalized with flu and a fever, and in the following month, he was hospitalized with pneumonia, just days after receiving treatment for bronchitis. Life after resignation. Yeltsin maintained a low profile after his resignation, making almost no public statements or appearances. He criticized his successor Putin in December 2000 for supporting the reintroduction of the tune of the Soviet-era national anthem. In January 2001 he was hospitalized for 6 weeks with pneumonia resulting from a viral infection. On September 13, 2004, following the Beslan school hostage crisis and nearly concurrent terrorist attacks in Moscow, Putin launched an initiative to replace the election of regional governors with a system whereby they would be directly appointed by the president and approved by regional legislatures. Yeltsin, together with Mikhail Gorbachev, publicly criticized Putin's plan as a step away from democracy in Russia and a return to the centrally run political apparatus of the Soviet era. In September 2005, Yeltsin underwent a hip operation in Moscow after breaking his femur in a fall while on holiday in the Italian island of Sardinia. On February 1, 2006, Yeltsin celebrated his 75th birthday. Death and funeral. Yeltsin died of congestive heart failure on April 23, 2007, aged 76. According to experts quoted by Komsomolskaya Pravda, the onset of Yeltsin's condition began during his visit to Jordan between March 25 and April 2. He was buried in the Novodevichy Cemetery on April 25, 2007, following a period during which his body had lain in repose in the Cathedral of Christ the Savior in Moscow. Yeltsin was the first Russian head of state in 113 years to be buried in a church ceremony, after Emperor Alexander III. He was survived by his wife, Nana Iosifovna Yeltsina, whom he married in 1956, and their 2 daughters Yelena and Tatyana, born in 1957 and 1960, respectively. President Putin declared the day of his funeral a national day of mourning, with the nation's flags flown at half-staff and all entertainment programs suspended for the day. Putin said, upon declaring April 25, 2007 a day of national mourning, that presidency has inscribed him forever in Russian and in world history. A new democratic Russia was born during his time, a free, open, and peaceful country. A state in which the power truly does belong to the people. The first president of Russia's strength consisted in the mass support of Russian citizens for his ideas and aspirations. Thanks to the will and direct initiative of President Boris Yeltsin, a new constitution, one which declared human rights a supreme value, was adopted. It gave people the opportunity to freely express their thoughts, to freely choose power in Russia, to realize their creative and entrepreneurial plans. This constitution permitted us to begin building a truly effective federation. We knew him as a brave and a warm-hearted, spiritual person. He was an upstanding and courageous national leader. And he was always very honest and frank while defending his position. Assumed full responsibility for everything he called for everything he aspired to. For everything he tried to do and did do for the sake of Russia, for the sake of millions of Russians. And he invariably took upon himself, let it in his heart, all the trials and tribulations of Russia, people's difficulties and problems. Shortly after the news broke, former Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev issued a statement, saying, "I express my profoundest condolences to the family of the deceased, who had major deeds for the good of the country as well as serious mistakes behind him. It was a tragic destiny." Ideology. During the late Soviet period, Yeltsin's ideological worldview began to shift. Colton argued that populism and a non-ethnic Russianism had begun to enter Yeltsin's thinking while he was first secretary of Sverdlovsk. In the late 1980s, Yeltsin told the Athens daily newspaper Kothai Miranai that "I regard myself as a social democrat," adding, "Those who still believe in communism are moving in the sphere of fantasy." Linking Yeltsin with liberal Russian nationalism, Alfred B. Evans described Yeltsin as having exerted a crucial influence on the development of Russian nationalism. Yeltsin helped to channel the aspirations of Russian nationalism in ways that did not lead to clashes with the nationalisms of other national groups within the Soviet Union. As head of the Russian SFSR, he stressed the specific interests of the Russian Republic within the broader Soviet Union. Evans compared Yeltsin's turn away from the empire-building of the Soviet Union to the ideas of the writer and dissident Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who had called in the 1980s for Russia to extricate itself from the Soviet Union. However, Evans thought that Yeltsin still appeared to believe by 1990 that the Ukrainians and Belarusians, as fellow East Slavic nationalities, would want to remain politically united with Russia in federal form. By 1991, it was obvious that this would not occur as the Ukrainian population favored full independence. Over the course of his presidency, he made increasing concessions to right-wing ethnic Russian nationalism by expressing growing concern over the fate of ethnic Russians in neighboring countries. Personal life. Colton described Yeltsin as a man who teemed with inner complexities, who exhibited both a mathematical cast of mind and a taste for adventure, noting that Yeltsin had the intuition for grasping a situation holistically. Colton thought Yeltsin could be bull-headed and restless. Evans noted that in Yeltsin's autobiography, the leader appeared to view himself as more of a Soviet person than a Russian. Throughout his life, Yeltsin sustained a number of health problems which he would usually try to conceal. As a child, he sustained both a broken nose and a maimed hand, physical attributes he remained self-conscious about. In public he would often conceal his left hand under the table or behind his tie. He was also deaf on the right side due to a middle ear infection. Although his mother was a devout Orthodox Christian, Yeltsin did not grow up as a practitioner, only becoming so in the 1980s and 1990s. Yeltsin stated that his style of management was tough and that he demanded strict discipline and fulfillment of promises. Yeltsin was a workaholic. At UPI University, he developed the habit of sleeping for only 4 hours at night. He was punctual and very strict regarding the tardiness of his subordinates. He had an excellent memory, and enjoyed reading. By 1985 his family had around 6,000 volumes in their possession. At UPI University, he was known for enjoying practical jokes. He enjoyed listening to folk songs and pop tunes, and from youth could play the Losky spoons. Until poor health stopped him in the 1990s, Yeltsin enjoyed swimming in icy water, and throughout his life started each day with a cold shower. He also loved using the banya steam bath. Yeltsin also enjoyed hunting and had his own collection of hunting guns. He liked to give watches and other keepsakes to his employees, often as a means of motivating them to work harder. He disliked people swearing, and when frustrated or angry, he was known to often snap pencils in his hand. Yeltsin had a high tolerance for alcohol, and by the 1980s he was drinking alcohol at or above the average for the party elite. Yeltsin's favorite writer was Anton Chekhov, although he also enjoyed the work of Sergei Yesenin and Alexander Pushkin. Colton described Yeltsin as having a husky baritone voice. Dodor and Branson noted that Yeltsin was a hero for young Russians, a cult figure to those who were not necessarily anti-communists but who were filled with bitterness and apathy from the Brezhnev years. They noted he was ebullient, almost outrageously open, and also charismatic. They added that Yeltsin presented himself as a true working-class hero when challenging the Soviet administration. Yeltsin had nevertheless always wanted a son. Yelena briefly married a school friend, Alexei Fiflov, against her parents' wishes. They had a daughter, Yekaterina, in 1979, before separating. Yelena then married an Aeroflot pilot, Valery Okulov, with whom she had a second daughter, Maria, in 1983. Yeltsin's other daughter, Tatyana, married fellow student Violin Karelin, an ethnic Tatar, while studying at Moscow State University in 1980. In 1981 they had a son, named Boris after his grandfather, but soon separated. Tatyana then married again, to Leonid Dyachenko, and for a while they lived with Yeltsin at his Moscow apartment during the mid-1980s. Yeltsin was loyal to his friends. As friends, Yeltsin selected individuals he deemed to be professionally competent and morally fastidious. Aaron noted that Yeltsin could be an inexhaustible fount of merriment, exuberance, and hospitality among his friends. Reception and legacy. Evaluations of Yeltsin range from highly positive to highly negative, with not much in the middle. Former United States Ambassador to Russia Michael McFaul emphasizes the range pro and con. Yeltsin certainly deserves credit for monumental achievements. On his watch, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was destroyed, the largest empire on earth was peacefully dismantled, and electoral democracy was introduced into a country with a 1,000-year history of autocratic rule. Yeltsin invites and eludes a ringing assessment. Was he a heroic revolutionary, or an erratic reformer? An astute politician and a committed Democrat, or a populist improviser with little interest in the hard work of coalition building? Was he a daring economic reformer, or a blundering tool of the oligarchs? Does he emerge as a larger-than-life leader who rose to unprecedented challenges, or as a figure overwhelmed by the enormity of change? The answer, not surprisingly, is that Yeltsin was all of the above. Colton suggested that Yeltsin leaves nobody indifferent. He needs to be understood if we are to understand the age we inhabit. Aaron characterized him as Russia's first modern leader. Colton understood him as a hero in history, albeit one who was enigmatic and flawed. He expressed the view that Yeltsin was part of the global trend away from authoritarianism and statism that occurred in the 1990s, comparing him to Nelson Mandela, Lech Walesa, Václav Havel, and Mikhail Gorbachev. In the years following his presidency, there was comparatively little interest among biographers and historians in researching Yeltsin's life. During his career as a figure in the Soviet Union, Yeltsin received 10 medals and awards for his service to the state. In April 2008, a new memorial to Yeltsin was dedicated in Moscow's Novodevichy Cemetery, to mixed reactions. At the memorial service, a military chorus performed Russia's national anthem, an anthem that was changed shortly after the end of Yeltsin's term, to follow the music of the old Soviet anthem, with lyrics reflecting Russia's new status. Ryabov, who was formerly a close ally of Yeltsin's, claimed that his actions in the 1990s revealed that he was a turncoat. In 2013, a memorial sculpture in relief, dedicated to Yeltsin, was erected on Nun Street, at the base of the Patkolai Stairs in Tallinn, for his contribution to the peaceful independence of Estonia during 1990–1991. In 2015, the Boris Yeltsin Presidential Center was opened in Ekaterinburg. Honors and awards. Russian and Soviet. Russia, Order for Merit to the Fatherland, First Class, a particularly outstanding contribution to the establishment and development of the Russian state. Soviet Union, Order of Lenin for services to the Communist Party and Soviet state and his 50th birthday. Soviet Union, Order of the Red Banner of Labor, twice, August 1971 for services in carrying out a 5-year plan. January 1974 for achievements in the construction of the first stage of cold rolling shop at the Verkhyzhetsky metallurgical plant in Sverdlovsk. Soviet Union, Order of the Badge of Honor for achievements in implementing the 7-year plan targets for construction. Russia, Medal in commemoration of the 1000th anniversary of Kazan. Soviet Union, Jubilee Medal in commemoration of the 100th anniversary of the birth of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. Soviet Union, Jubilee Medal 30 Years of Victory in the Great Patriotic War 1941–1945. Soviet Union, Jubilee Medal 60 Years of the Armed Forces of the USSR. Soviet Union, Gold Medal, Exhibition of Economic Achievements. Russia, Medal in memory of the Army as a volunteer for a high contribution to the remembrance of the Great Patriotic War, with respect for the history of the Russian state, and for his contribution to the preservation of names of victims in conflicts in defense of the homeland. Foreign awards. Belarus, Order of Francisc Scarina for his great personal contribution to the development and strengthening of Belarusian-Russian cooperation. Kazakhstan, Order of the Golden Eagle. Ukraine, Order of Prince Yaroslav the Wise, First Class for his significant personal contribution to the development of Ukrainian-Russian cooperation. Italy, Knight Grand Cross with Collar of the Order of Merit of the Italian Republic. Latvia, Order of the Three Stars, First Class. Palestine, Order Bethlehem 2000. France, Knight Grand Cross of the Legion of Honor. South Africa, Order of Good Hope, First Class. Lithuania, Medal of January 13th. Lithuania, Grand Cross of the Order of the Cross of Vitus. Mongolia, Order for Personal Courage Departmental Awards. Russia, Gorchakov Commemorative Medal. International Olympic Committee, Golden Olympic Order Religious Awards. Russia, Order of Saint Blessed Grand Prince Dmitry Donskoy, First Class. Greece, Chevalier of the Order of the Chain of the Holy Sepulchre titles. Honorary Citizen of Russia, Sverdlovsk Oblast. Russia, Kazan. Russia, Samara Oblast. Armenia, Yerevan. Turkmenistan, Turkmenistan. Greece, Corfu. See also: Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Dissolution of the Soviet Union. History of the Soviet Union. Mikhail Gorbachev. Alexander Ruskoy. Vladimir Putin. President of Russia. Yeltsinism. Someone Still Loves You. Boris Yeltsin. Spinning Boris.